The day I buried my husband, I finally opened the shed he had forbidden me to touch for 30 years. I thought I'd find old tools and forgotten junk. But what I discovered inside, what my husband hid from me for almost 4 decades, shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. And when my son Richard found out the truth, he almost killed us all. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with me today. Before we continue, take a moment to comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I love knowing how far this story reaches. But before getting into the story, support me by liking and subscribing right now. I also want to greet you all. Leave me in the comments your name, your city, and ideas for future stories. Thank you. And just a quick note before we continue. This story includes some dramatized elements for narrative and educational purposes. Any similarity to real people, names, or places is purely coincidental, but the message behind it is meant to be meaningful. I never thought saying goodbye to Robert would be the easy part. It was everything that came after that almost destroyed me. The church was quiet that morning in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Too quiet. I was 68 years old and felt like I was 100. I stood at the front, staring at the wooden casket covered with white lilies. Robert had always loved lilies. I used to grow them in the garden every spring. Now they were here, resting on top of him like a blanket he would never feel. Pastor Morrison stood beside me. He said something about heaven, peace, and how Robert was in a better place now. I nodded. I didn't hear most of it. My mind was somewhere else, far from this small church, far from the rows of neighbors and friends sitting behind me whispering their condolences. 30 years. That's how long we'd been married. 30 years waking up next to him, hearing his laughter in the kitchen, watching him work on the farm behind our house. And now he was gone. I looked around the room. Faces I recognized, faces I didn't. And then I saw him. Richard, my son. He walked in late, his suit perfectly pressed, his expression cold and distant. He didn't look at the casket. He looked at me. He sat down in the back row. He didn't come up to say hello. He didn't put his hand on my shoulder. He just sat there, checking his phone like he had somewhere better to be. I felt something heavy settle in my chest. Disappointment, anger, maybe both. After the service ended, people came up to shake my hand. They told me how sorry they were. They told me Robert was a wonderful man. I thanked them. I said all the right things, but I didn't feel anything. I was numb. Richard finally approached me as everyone was leaving. He didn't hug me. He didn't ask how I was holding up. Instead, he said, "We need to talk about the will." I stared at him. "The will?" "Yes," he said flatly. "The farm? The estate? We need to figure out what happens now." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. His father had just been buried, and all he cared about was money. I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell him how disgusted I was, but I was too tired, too broken. "Not today, Richard," I said quietly. He frowned. "Mom, we can't avoid this forever." "Not today," I repeated. He sighed, then turned and walked away without another word. I watched him leave. I watched my only son walk out of that church without looking back. And I realized something in that moment. I had lost more than just my husband. I had lost my family too. By the time I got home, the sun was setting. The farmhouse looked empty without Robert. The front porch where he used to sit with his coffee. The kitchen where he used to hum old songs while making dinner. The bedroom where we used to talk late into the night. Everything felt hollow now. I walked to the window in the living room and looked out at the fields. And that's when I saw it. The garden shed. It sat at the edge of the property, small and weathered, surrounded by tall grass. Robert had always kept it locked. He had always told me to stay away from it. I remembered the day he made me promise. It was years ago, not long after we got married. We were standing in the backyard and he took my hand and looked me straight in the eyes. "Promise me something, Grace," he said softly. Anything, I replied. Promise me you'll never go into that shed. No matter what happens, promise me. I didn't understand why it mattered so much to him, but I saw the fear in his eyes, the desperation. So I promised. I promised I would never go in there. He smiled then, relieved, like I had just saved him from something terrible. For 30 years I kept that promise. I never asked him why. I never tried to open the door. I trusted him. And he trusted me to stay away. But now he was gone, and I was alone. 3 days after the funeral, I found something in Robert's jewelry box that made my hands shake. I had been avoiding it. The bedroom, his closet, his things. Every corner of that house reminded me of him, and I wasn't ready to face it yet. But 3 days had passed, and I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I had to start going through his belongings. I had to start letting go. So that morning, I woke up early. The sun was barely rising over the fields. I made myself a cup of coffee and went upstairs to our bedroom. The door creaked when I opened it. The room still smelled like him. Lavender and vanilla, the scent of his aftershave. The smell hit me hard, and for a moment I almost turned around and left, but I didn't. I walked over to his dresser and opened the top drawer. Handkerchiefs, gloves, some old letters tied with string. I set them aside carefully. Then I opened the second drawer. More clothes. A photo album I'd never seen before. I made a mental note to look through it later, and then I saw it. The jewelry box, the same one I had opened the night of the funeral. I stared at it for a long time. My heart was already racing and I hadn't even touched it yet. I picked it up slowly and sat down on the edge of the bed. I opened the lid. The rings were still there, the necklace, the earrings, and beneath them, tucked in the corner of the box, was a small brass key. I lifted it out carefully. It was cold in my hand, heavy, old, the kind of key that had been used for decades. And attached to it, folded neatly, was a small piece of paper. I unfolded it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was his, neat and familiar, and it said only 2 words. Forgive me. I read it again and again. Forgive me. For what? What could he possibly need forgiveness for? I looked out the window. The garden shed sat at the edge of the property, exactly where it had always been. Small, weathered, locked. For 30 years I had walked past it every single day. And for 30 years I had never once tried to go inside because I had promised him. I stood up and walked to the window. The key was still in my hand. I could feel its weight pulling me toward something I didn't understand, something I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. But I had to know. I had to know what he had been hiding from me all these years. I went downstairs, put on my boots, and stepped outside. The morning air was cool and crisp. The fields were quiet. The only sound was the wind rustling through the tall grass. I walked slowly across the yard toward the shed. Each step felt heavier than the last. My heart was pounding in my chest. My hands were sweating. I told myself I could turn back. I could leave the key on the kitchen counter and forget about it. I could keep my promise to Robert even now, even after he was gone. But I couldn't. I reached the shed and stood in front of the door. It was old. The wood was cracked and faded. The lock was rusted. I wondered how long it had been since anyone had opened it. 10 years? 20? Maybe longer? I lifted the key and held it in front of the lock. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Promise me, Grace. I could still hear his voice, clear as day, like he was standing right behind me. Promise me you'll never go in there. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I'm sorry, Robert, I whispered. I'm so sorry, but I have to know. I slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. I turned it slowly. The lock clicked. The sound echoed in the quiet morning air. For a moment, I just stood there, my hand on the door handle, my heart racing. I thought about turning around. I thought about locking it again and walking away. But I didn't. I pushed the door open. The hinges creaked loudly. The sound made me flinch. Sunlight poured into the dark space, illuminating dust particles floating in the air. The smell hit me immediately. Old wood, dirt, something musty and forgotten. I stepped inside slowly. My eyes adjusted to the dim light. Shelves lined the walls, covered with old gardening tools, pots, bags of soil, rusted shovels. Everything was coated with a thick layer of dust. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, hidden behind a stack of old flower pots, was a wooden desk. It was small, simple, the kind of desk someone might use for writing letters or keeping records. But it didn't belong here, not in a garden shed, not covered in dust like it had been forgotten for decades. I walked toward it slowly. My boots crunched on the dirt floor. I reached out and touched the surface of the desk. My fingers left trails in the dust. There was a drawer at the front with a small brass handle. I hesitated for just a moment, and then I pulled it open. The inside of the shed was darker than I expected. Even with the door open, the sunlight only reached so far. The air was thick and stale, like no one had breathed in here for decades. I took a step forward, and the floorboards creaked beneath my boots. I looked around slowly. Shelves covered both walls, filled with things I recognized. Old ceramic pots, cracked and chipped, rusted gardening tools, bags of soil that had hardened like stone, a watering can with a broken handle. Everything looked forgotten, abandoned. But none of it explained why Robert had kept me out of here for so long. I moved deeper into the shed, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. And then I saw it again. The desk. It sat against the back wall, half hidden behind a stack of empty flower pots. It was small and plain, made of dark wood that had dulled with age. But it looked out of place here. Too clean, too intentional. I walked toward it carefully, as if getting too close might make it disappear. When I reached it, I ran my hand across the surface. The wood was smooth under my fingers. Someone had taken care of this desk. Someone had used it. Robert. I crouched down and looked closer. There was a single drawer at the front, fitted with a small brass lock. My heart started to race. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key, the same key I had found in his jewelry box, the same key that had brought me here. I slid it into the lock. It turned easily, like it had been waiting for me. I pulled the drawer open. Inside was a leather-bound journal. It was old and worn, the edges frayed from years of use. Beside it was a small wooden box, no bigger than my hand. I lifted the journal out carefully and set it on top of the desk. The leather felt soft and warm, like it had been held many times before. I hesitated. My hands were shaking again. Part of me wanted to close the drawer and walk away. Part of me wanted to pretend I had never found this place. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was his. I recognized it immediately, neat and careful, just like the note he had left with the key. But this time, there was more than 2 words. "Grace," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for keeping this from you. I'm sorry for lying to you all these years. But you need to know the truth. You need to know about Matthew." I stopped reading. My breath caught in my throat. Matthew. The name hit me like a punch to the chest. I stared at it, written there in his handwriting, and felt nothing. No recognition, no memory, nothing. Who was Matthew? I read the line again. You need to know the truth. You need to know about Matthew. My mind raced. Was Matthew an old friend? A relative I'd never met? Someone from his past? I tried to think back through all the years we'd been together. Every conversation, every story he'd ever told me. But I couldn't remember anyone named Matthew. Not once. I set the journal down and pressed my hands against the desk. My heart was pounding. My head was spinning. I felt like the ground beneath me was starting to shift. For 30 years I had thought I knew my husband. I had thought we had no secrets, no lies. But here I was, Standing in a shed he had forbidden me from entering, holding a journal I never knew existed, reading about someone named Matthew. Who was he? I looked down at the journal again. There were more pages, so many more pages. I could see the edges of them filled with his handwriting, waiting to be read, waiting to tell me the truth. But I didn't want to read them. Not yet. I wasn't ready. I picked up the small wooden box and held it in my hands. It was light. I shook it gently and heard something shift inside. Photographs, maybe, or letters. I thought about opening it, but I couldn't. Not right now. Not when my hands were still shaking and my mind was still reeling from that name. Matthew. I set the box back in the drawer and closed it carefully. Then I picked up the journal again and stared at the first page, at his words, at that name. I wanted to stop. I wanted to walk out of the shed and lock the door behind me and pretend I had never opened it. But I knew I couldn't do that. I knew I had to keep reading. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I took a deep breath, and then I turned the page. Friends, every story I tell you comes out every day. But YouTube will only show them to you if you hit the red subscribe button. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and you'll never miss a story. Thank you. The second page began with a date. 40 years ago, long before we were married, long before I ever met him. And the first sentence read, I was 20 years old when I had a son. I felt the air leave my lungs. Matthew. The name meant nothing to me, but as I turned the page and kept reading, my entire world began to fall apart. Robert was 20 years old when he had a son. I was 28 at the time, working at a store in Des Moines. We hadn't even met yet. I found an old wooden stool in the corner of the shed and pulled it over to the desk. The light from a small window above me cast a pale glow across the pages of the journal. I sat down slowly and began to read. His story unfolded in front of me, word by word, like a life I had never known. He was young, just out of high school. He had dreams of going to college, of becoming an engineer. But then he met someone, a girl from another town. He didn't write her name. He just called her a mistake I made when I was too young to know better. She got pregnant that summer, and when she told her parents, they were furious. They gave her two choices: give up the baby or leave their home forever. She was 18 years old. She had no money, no job, nowhere to go. So she made the only choice she thought she could. She gave him up. His name was Matthew. Robert wrote about the day he handed him over to the orphanage, how he held him for the last time, counted his tiny fingers, kissed his forehead. How Mrs. Henderson, the woman who ran the place, promised to take good care of him. How Robert walked out of that building with empty arms and a broken heart. But he didn't stop there. He couldn't. For 40 years, he watched over him from a distance. He hired a private investigator named Stephen Brooks. He paid him every month to keep track of Matthew, to send him photographs, to tell him where he was, what he was doing, if he was safe. I read page after page, reports from Stephen Brooks, updates on Matthew's life, school records, jobs he worked, places he lived. Robert had kept everything. Every scrap of paper, every photograph, every piece of evidence that his son was still out there, still alive, still breathing. And then I got to the last few pages, the ones written just weeks before he passed away. Matthew is 40 years old now, he wrote. He works as a carpenter in a small town about 200 miles from here. He lives alone in a one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store. He has no family, no wife, no children. He spent his whole life thinking no one wanted him. And I did that to him. I made him believe he was unwanted, unloved. His handwriting became shaky here. I could see where the ink had smudged, like he had been crying as he wrote. Grace, he continued, I know I should have told you about him. I know I should have trusted you. But I was so afraid. Afraid you would think less of me. Afraid you would leave. Afraid you wouldn't understand. So I kept him a secret. I kept him locked away in this shed, hidden from the world, hidden from you. And now I'm dying and I can't fix what I've done. I stopped reading. My hands were shaking. My chest felt tight. I could barely breathe. I set the journal down and looked at the small wooden box in the drawer, the one I had seen earlier but hadn't opened. I picked it up carefully and lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all of Matthew. The first one showed a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. His eyes were closed. His little fists were curled up against his chest. On the back, someone had written, "Matthew, 3 days old." I flipped to the next one. A toddler sitting on a swing, smiling at the camera. Then a boy in a school uniform holding a lunchbox. A teenager standing in front of a car, looking awkward and unsure. And finally, a man. A grown man with dark hair and tired eyes. He was standing in front of a woodworking shop, holding a piece of carved oak in his hands. On the back of that photograph, it said, "Matthew, 40 years old, still alone." I stared at the picture for a long time. He looked like him. He had Robert's eyes, his nose, his smile. I had looked at my husband's face every day for 30 years, and now I was looking at a stranger who also had his face. I set the photograph down and picked up the journal again. There was one more page, one final entry. "Grace," he wrote, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for lying to you. I'm sorry for keeping this from you. But I need you to do something for me. Please, Grace, find him. Find Matthew. Give him the family I never could. He deserves a chance. He deserves to know he was loved. Please do this for me. Do this for him." I closed the journal and set it down on the desk. I leaned back against the wall and closed my eyes. My mind was spinning. My heart was breaking. Robert had a son he never told me about, a son who had spent his entire life alone, thinking no one cared about him. A son who was out there right now, 200 miles away, living in a one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store, carving pieces of wood and wondering why his life had turned out this way. And he wanted me to find him. I opened my eyes and looked at the photograph again. Matthew, 40 years old, dark hair, tired eyes, Robert's face. Could I do it? Could I drive 200 miles to a town I'd never been to and knock on the door of a man I'd never met and tell him that his father had loved him all along? Could I bring him into my life, into my home, and give him the family Robert had asked me to give him? I didn't know. I didn't know if I was strong enough. I didn't know if I was brave enough. But I knew I had to try. I sat there until the sun went down, staring at the photograph of a man I'd never met, Robert's son. And I made a decision that would change everything. Finding Matthew wasn't hard. Robert had kept detailed records. The hard part was figuring out what I was going to say to him. I woke up early the next morning, before the sun rose. I couldn't sleep. My mind had been racing all night, replaying everything I had read in that journal, everything I had learned, everything I still didn't understand. I went downstairs and made coffee. Then I sat at the kitchen table and spread out the papers Robert had left behind. The journal, the photographs, the handwritten notes with addresses and phone numbers. Everything Stephen Brooks had sent him over the years. There it was, the address of the woodworking shop where Matthew worked. A small town called Bloomington, Illinois, 5 hours away by car. I memorized the directions, folded the papers carefully, and put them in my jacket pocket. I was halfway out the door when my phone rang. Richard. I stared at the screen for a moment. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but I knew he would just keep calling. So I answered. "Good morning, Mom," he said. His voice sounded flat, distant, as always. "Good morning. What are you doing today?" I hesitated. I didn't want to lie to him, but I also couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. Not until I understood what I was doing myself. "I'm going to visit an old friend," I said finally. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "An old friend?" Richard repeated. "Who?" "Just someone I used to know. Nobody you'd remember." Another pause. "All right. he said slowly. Well, call me if you need anything. I will. He hung up without saying goodbye. I stood there for a moment staring at my phone. I hated lying to him, but I didn't know what else to do. How could I explain that I was driving 5 hours to meet a man I'd never heard of until yesterday? How could I tell him that his father had kept a secret from both of us for nearly 40 years? I couldn't. Not yet. I grabbed my keys and walked out to my old pickup truck. It was the same truck I'd been driving for 15 years. The paint was faded, the seats were worn, but it still ran, and that was all I needed. I climbed in, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway. The sun was just beginning to rise over the fields. The sky was pale and clear. It was going to be a long day. For the first hour, I didn't think about anything. I just drove. I watched the farms roll by, the open fields, the silos and barns scattered across the landscape. It was peaceful, quiet, the kind of quiet that made you forget the world existed beyond the next mile marker. But then the thoughts started creeping in. What was I going to say to Matthew? How do you walk up to a stranger and tell him his father loved him? How do you explain that he spent 40 years watching over him from a distance, too afraid to reach out, too ashamed to tell the truth? And what if he didn't believe me? What if he thought I was lying? What if he slammed the door in my face and told me to leave him alone? Or worse, what if he believed me but didn't care? What if he looked at me with those tired eyes and said, "It's too late, he's gone, there's nothing left to fix"? I gripped the steering wheel tighter. My hands were shaking. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I should turn around. Maybe I should go home and forget I ever opened that shed. But I couldn't. I had made a promise to Robert, to Matthew, to myself. I kept driving. By the time I reached Bloomington, it was almost noon. The town was smaller than I expected. One main street, a few shops, a diner, a gas station. And at the far end of the street, tucked between an old hardware store and a vacant lot, was a small workshop with a hand-painted sign that read, Matthew's Woodworks. I parked my truck across the street and sat there for a moment. My heart was pounding. My mouth was dry. I stared at the workshop, trying to build up the courage to get out of the truck. Through the large front window, I could see movement inside. A figure bent over a workbench, tools scattered around, wood shavings on the floor. That was him. That was Matthew. I took a deep breath, then I opened the truck door and stepped out. I walked slowly across the street, my boots crunching on the gravel. When I reached the window, I stopped and looked inside. He was standing at the workbench, his back to me. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt and jeans. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. His hands moved carefully over a piece of oak, sanding it smooth with steady, practiced strokes. I watched him for a moment. He looked focused, calm, like this was the only place in the world where he felt at peace. And then, as if he sensed someone watching, he turned around. He was bent over the workbench, sanding a piece of wood. When he looked up, I forgot how to breathe. It was like seeing Robert again, 30 years younger. "Can I help you?" he asked. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. "How do you tell a stranger he's your husband's son?" He stepped out of the workshop, wiping his hands on a rag. He was tall, thin. His hands were rough and calloused from years of working with wood. His dark hair was streaked with sawdust, and his eyes, those eyes, they were Robert's eyes. The same shape, the same color, the same quiet sadness behind them. "Ma'am," he said again, tilting his head slightly. "Are you all right?" I cleared my throat and forced myself to speak. "My name is Grace Patterson," I said. "I was married to a man named Robert." He frowned, clearly confused. "Robert?" he repeated slowly. "I don't know anyone named Robert." I took a deep breath. This was it. There was no going back now. "He was your father," I said. The words hung in the air between us. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Matthew took a step back, his expression hardening. "My father," he said, his voice sharp. "My father abandoned me when I was 3 days old. I don't know who you are, but you need to leave. Wait, I said quickly, holding up my hands. Please, just listen to me. I know this sounds crazy. I know you don't know me. But I'm telling you the truth. Robert was your father, and he never forgot about you. He stared at me, his jaw tight. Why should I believe you? I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the journal. Then I pulled out the photographs. I held them out to him. Because he kept this, I said. For 40 years, he kept track of you. He hired someone to watch over you, to make sure you were safe, to send him pictures. He never stopped thinking about you, Matthew, not once. He looked down at the journal in my hands, then at the photographs. His expression softened just slightly. Curiosity replaced anger. What is that? He asked quietly. It's his journal, I said. He wrote about you, about the day he had to give you up, about how much he regretted it, about how he watched you grow up from a distance. He hesitated, then slowly reached out and took the journal from my hands. He opened it carefully like it might break. His eyes moved across the first page, reading Robert's handwriting. His hands started to shake. This is, he whispered. This is about me. Yes, I said. He flipped through the pages slowly, carefully. His breathing became shallow. His eyes welled up with tears. He stopped on a page and read it out loud, his voice breaking. It says, Matthew turned 5 today. Stephen sent me a photograph. He was wearing a blue shirt and holding a toy truck. He looked so happy. I wish I could have been there. I wish I could have given him that truck myself. Matthew closed the journal and looked up at me. Tears were streaming down his face now. He never forgot me, he whispered. Never, I said. Not for a single day. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and set the journal down on the workbench. Then he looked at the photographs. I watched as he picked up the first one. A baby wrapped in a blue blanket, then a toddler on a swing, then a boy in a school uniform, and finally, the most recent one. Himself, at 40 years old, standing in front of this very workshop. He had all of these? He asked, his voice barely audible. Yes, I said. He kept them in a box in a shed behind our house. He made me promise never to go in there. I didn't know why. Not until he passed away. Matthew looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen. He's gone, he said. I nodded. 3 weeks ago. He sat down on a wooden crate and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. He was crying. Not loud, sobbing cries, just quiet, heartbroken tears. I didn't know what to do. So I just stood there, waiting, giving him time. After a long moment, he looked up at me. I spent my whole life thinking no one wanted me, he said quietly. I grew up in that orphanage wondering why my father left me, why he didn't come back. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need him. But it did matter. It always mattered. He wanted to come back, I said. He wanted to find you, but he was scared. He thought you would hate him. He thought it was too late. It wasn't too late, Matthew said, his voice breaking again. It was never too late. We stood there in silence for a while. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the workshop floor. The smell of fresh-cut wood filled the air. It was peaceful, quiet, but heavy with emotion. Finally, I spoke. Matthew, I said, Robert left you something in his journal, a final request. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with hope and fear. What? He wanted you to have a family, I said. He wanted you to have a home. He asked me to find you, to bring you back to the farm, to give you the life he couldn't give you himself. Matthew stared at me. You want me to come live with you? Yes, I said. I know it sounds strange. I know we just met. But Robert loved you. And I want to honor his wish. I want to give you a home. Matthew shook his head slowly. I don't belong there, he said. I'm just a stranger. A mistake from his past. You're not a mistake, I said firmly. You're his son. And if you were his son, then you're part of my family too." He looked at me for a long time. His eyes searched my face, looking for something. Honesty, maybe. Sincerity. Whatever it was, he must have found it, because his expression softened. "I've never had a home," he said quietly. "Not a real one." I took a deep breath. "Matthew, I want you to come home with me. To the farm. That's what Robert would have wanted." He looked at me for a long time. Then he whispered, "Home? I've never had a home." Matthew followed me in his old pickup truck. I watched him in my rearview mirror and wondered how Richard was going to react. The drive back felt longer than the drive out. Maybe it was because I wasn't alone anymore. Maybe it was because I knew what was waiting for me when I got there. Richard, my son. The son who had always been cold and distant. The son who cared more about money than family. How was I going to explain this to him? How was I going to tell him that his father had a secret? That he had a brother he never knew existed? I glanced in the mirror again. Matthew was still there, his truck rattling along behind me. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. His eyes were focused on the road ahead. He looked nervous, scared even. And I didn't blame him. He was driving toward a life he had never imagined, a family he had never known, a place that felt like a dream. By the time we reached the farm, the sun was starting to set. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink. The fields stretched out on either side of the road, golden and endless. It was the kind of view that made you stop and remember why you loved this place. I pulled into the driveway and parked near the house. Matthew parked beside me. I got out of my truck and waited for him. He sat there for a moment, staring out the windshield at the farm, at the barn, at the house, at the land. Then he opened his door and stepped out slowly. He looked around, his eyes wide with wonder. He had never seen anything like this. I could tell he had spent his whole life in small apartments and cramped spaces. And now he was standing in the middle of 300 acres of open land. "This is it," I said. "This is the farm." He nodded slowly. "It's beautiful." "Robert loved it here," I said. "He used to sit on the porch every morning and watch the sun rise over the fields. He said it was the most peaceful place in the world." Matthew didn't say anything. He just kept looking around, taking it all in. The barn, the chicken coop, the old tractor parked near the shed, the garden where Robert used to grow vegetables, everything. "Come on," I said. "Let me show you inside." We walked up the front steps and into the house. The screen door creaked as I opened it. The inside was warm and quiet. It smelled like coffee and old wood, like a place that had been lived in for decades. I led Matthew into the living room. The walls were covered in framed photographs, pictures of Robert and me on our wedding day. Pictures of Richard when he was a little boy riding his first bike. Pictures of the farm through the years, a whole lifetime captured in a dozen frames. Matthew stopped in front of one of the pictures. It was Robert. He was young in the photo, maybe 25 years old. He was standing in the garden holding a basket of tomatoes. He was smiling. Happy. Handsome. Matthew reached out and touched the frame gently, his fingers trembling. "That was taken a few years after we got married," I said quietly. He loved that garden. He spent hours out there every summer. Matthew didn't say anything. He just stood there staring at the picture. His eyes filled with tears, but he didn't let them fall. He just kept looking at it. At the woman who had given him life. At the father he had never known. After a long moment, he turned to me. "Thank you," he said softly, "for bringing me here, for showing me this. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," I said. "You're family now." He looked at me, his expression uncertain. "Am I?" "Yes," I said firmly. "You are." He nodded slowly, but I could tell he didn't quite believe it yet. How could he? He had spent his whole life being told he was unwanted, unloved. And now, in the span of a few hours, everything had changed. It would take time for him to accept it, to believe it. I'll teach you everything you need to know about running this place, I said. How to work the land, how to take care of the animals. You'll learn fast, I can tell. Matthew smiled faintly. I hope so. We stood there for a moment, surrounded by photographs and memories. The house felt alive again, like it had been waiting for someone to come home. But then Matthew asked the question I had been dreading. What about Richard? He said. Your son. How is he going to feel about this? About me? I hesitated. I didn't know what to say because the truth was, I had no idea how Richard was going to react. I knew he would be angry. I knew he would feel betrayed. But I also hoped that deep down he would understand, that he would accept Matthew as his brother. I'll talk to him, I said. He'll understand. Matthew looked at me, his eyes searching my face. Are you sure? Yes, I said. I'm sure. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to both of us. Richard arrived the next morning without warning. He walked into the kitchen and saw Matthew sitting at our table. The look on his face made my blood run cold. Matthew and I had been having coffee. We were talking about the farm, about what needed to be done that day, about where he would sleep. Simple things, quiet things. And then the door opened, and Richard walked in. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes moved from me to Matthew, then back to me. His expression was unreadable, cold, calculating. Who is this? He asked. I stood up slowly. Richard, sit down. We need to talk. I'm not sitting down, Richard said flatly. Who is he? Matthew looked down at his coffee cup. He didn't say anything. I could see his hands tighten around the mug. I took a deep breath. There was no easy way to do this, no way to soften the blow. So I just said it. His name is Matthew, I said. He's your father's son. Richard stared at me for a moment. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared. What? He said finally. Your father had a son before we got married, I said. He was 20 years old. His family made him give him up. He put him in an orphanage. But he never stopped watching over him. He hired someone to keep track of him, to make sure he was safe. He kept records, photographs, everything. Richard's face turned red. You're joking. I'm not joking, I said. I found his journal in the shed. He left it for me. He asked me to find him, to bring him home. Richard looked at Matthew again. His jaw was tight. His fists were clenched at his sides. So you just show up, Richard said to Matthew, his voice sharp. And suddenly you're my brother? Matthew didn't answer. He just sat there, looking uncomfortable, like he wanted to disappear. Richard turned back to me. And you, Mom, you're just going to give him half of everything, right? Half of the farm, half of the estate, half of what Dad left behind. This isn't about money, Richard, I said firmly. Not about money? Richard repeated, his voice rising. This is a farm, Mom. This is our livelihood. And you're bringing in some stranger and handing it to him like it's nothing. He's not a stranger, I said. He's your father's son. That makes him family. Richard laughed bitterly. Family? He's a stranger. Dad lied to you for 30 years. He kept this secret from you, from me, from everyone. And now you're rewarding him for it. Wait, I'm not rewarding anyone, I said, my voice hardening. I'm doing what he asked me to do. Matthew is his son. That makes him part of this family. And I'm going to teach him how to run this farm. Richard took a step forward. His eyes were burning with anger. Over my dead body, he said. The words hung in the air like a threat. I felt my chest tighten. I had never heard Richard speak to me like that before. Not with that much venom, that much hatred. Richard, I said quietly, I know this is hard. I know it's a shock. But Matthew didn't ask for any of this. He didn't know about your father. He didn't know about me. He spent his whole life thinking no one wanted him, and now he has a chance to have a family, to have a home. I'm not going to take that away from him. Richard shook his head slowly. You're making a mistake, Mom. Maybe I am, I said, but it's my mistake to make. Richard looked at Matthew one more time. His expression was cold, hard, unforgiving. "You don't belong here," Richard said to him. Matthew finally looked up. His eyes were tired, sad, but he didn't argue. He just nodded slightly, like he had expected this all along. Richard turned and walked toward the door. He grabbed the handle and pulled it open. Then he stopped and looked back at me. "You're choosing him over me," he said quietly. "I'm not choosing anyone," I said. "There's room for both of you." Richard laughed again, a short, bitter sound. "No, Mom," he said, "there's not." And then he walked out. The door slammed behind him so hard the windows rattled. The sound echoed through the house, through the silence, through everything. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door. My heart was pounding, my hands were shaking. I felt like I had just lost something I could never get back. Matthew spoke quietly behind me. "Maybe I should leave," he said. I turned to look at him. He was still sitting at the table, his shoulders slumped, his eyes downcast. He looked ready to walk away, to disappear, to go back to being alone. "No," I said firmly. "You're staying. This is your home now." Matthew looked at me. "He hates me." "He doesn't hate you," I said. "He's angry. He's confused, but he'll come around. He just needs time." Matthew didn't look convinced, and honestly, neither was I. "I don't want to cause problems," Matthew said. "I don't want to come between you and your son." "You're not coming between us," I said. "Richard is making this harder than it needs to be, but that's not your fault." Matthew nodded slowly, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, the fear, the guilt. I sat back down at the table and took a sip of my coffee. It was cold now, bitter, but I drank it anyway. "Give it time," I said. "He'll understand eventually." But even as I said it, I knew I should have been paying attention to the warning signs. Richard was gone, but the tension wasn't. Over the next 2 weeks, I threw myself into teaching Matthew everything I knew about the farm. He learned fast, maybe too fast, and that only made Richard angrier. I saw it in the way Richard would show up unannounced, standing at the edge of the property watching us work. He never came close. He never said a word. He just stood there, his arms crossed, his face hard and unreadable. And then, after a few minutes, he would get back in his car and drive away. But I could feel his eyes on us, cold, calculating, waiting. I tried not to think about it. I had work to do, and Matthew was eager to learn. On the first day, I taught him how to drive the tractor. It was an old John Deere, the same one I'd been using for 20 years. The engine was loud and the gears were stiff, but Matthew picked it up quickly. He had good hands, steady, confident, the kind of hands that came from years of working with wood. "You're a natural," I told him as we drove across the south field. He smiled. It was a small smile, but it was genuine. "I've never done anything like this before," he said. "But it feels right, you know?" I nodded. I knew exactly what he meant. Over the next few days, I taught him how to fix the equipment when it broke down, how to change the oil in the tractor, how to replace a belt on the hay baler, how to sharpen the blades on the mower. Matthew absorbed it all like a sponge. He asked questions. He took notes. He practiced until he got it right. And every evening after the work was done, we would sit on the front porch and talk. The porch had always been Robert's favorite spot. He used to sit out there every morning with his coffee, watching the sun rise over the fields. And now Matthew and I were sitting in the same spot, watching the sunset. One evening, Matthew asked me the question I had been waiting for. "What was he like?" he said quietly. "Robert? My father? What kind of person was he?" I leaned back in my chair and thought about it for a moment. How do you describe someone you loved for 30 years in just a few words? "He was kind," I said finally. "He had the biggest heart of anyone I ever met. He loved this farm. He loved working in the garden. Every spring he would plant tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers. He would spend hours out there pulling weeds and watering the plants. And every summer, we would have more vegetables than we knew what to do with. Matthew smiled. He sounds wonderful. He was, I said, but he was also stubborn. Once he made up his mind about something, there was no changing it, and he was private. He kept things to himself, like that shed. I never understood why he wanted me to stay away from it, but I trusted him. So I stayed away. Do you wish he had told you? Matthew asked. About me? I thought about that for a long time. Did I wish he had told me? Yes. It would have saved us all a lot of pain. But I also understood why he didn't. He was scared. He was ashamed. He thought I would judge him. He thought I would leave. I wish he had trusted me, I said. But I understand why he didn't, and I don't blame him for it. Matthew nodded slowly. I wish I could have met him. So do I said. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The air was cool and quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of crickets in the grass. And for the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. But that peace didn't last long. A few days later, I was in the barn with Matthew showing him how to feed the cattle. We were pouring grain into the troughs when I looked up and saw Richard standing at the barn entrance. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching us. His expression was cold, empty, like he was looking at strangers. Richard, I said, straightening up. Do you need something? He didn't answer. He just stared at Matthew for a long moment, and then without a word, he turned and walked away. Matthew looked at me, his face pale. He hates me, he said quietly. He doesn't hate you, I said. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. Over the next week, Richard showed up 3 more times. Each time he would stand at a distance and watch. And each time he would leave without saying a word. It was like he was studying us, waiting for something, planning something. And that's when I realized something that should have been obvious from the start. I was starting to love Matthew like he was my own son. He was hardworking, honest, kind. He reminded me of Robert in so many ways, the way he smiled, the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, the way he cared about things, about people, about doing the right thing. And I realized that in some strange way, Robert had given me a second chance, a second son, a second opportunity to be a mother. Thank you, Robert, I whispered to myself one night as I stood in the kitchen looking out at the dark fields. You gave me another son. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak and settle around me. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was coming, something I couldn't stop, something I should have seen. I thought about the way Richard had been watching us, the cold look in his eyes, the silence, the distance. And I realized I had made a terrible mistake. I had ignored the signs. I had told myself Richard would come around, that he would accept Matthew, that everything would be fine. But it wasn't going to be fine. If you want to know how this story ends and learn about many more, hit the red subscribe button. It's free and it helps me a lot. Thank you. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. I just didn't know how terrible it would be. Another week passed. Then the rumors began. Whispers at the feed store, side glances at church. I didn't understand what was happening until I finally heard what Richard had been saying about Matthew. At first, it was subtle. Too subtle to recognize right away. I drove into town one morning to pick up supplies at the hardware store. Bob Freeman stood behind the counter as he always did. We had known each other for years. Normally, he greeted me with a smile and a few questions about the farm. That morning, he looked at me differently. Not hostile, just cautious. "Morning, Grace," he said, scanning the items I placed on the counter. "Morning, Bob." That was it. No small talk, no farm talk. He rang me up, took my money, and handed me the bag without another word. I left the store with an uneasy feeling in my chest. A few minutes later, I ran into George Johnson outside the post office. George had been my neighbor for 2 decades. He stopped me, shifting his weight nervously. "Hey, Grace, can I ask you something?" "Sure." He hesitated. "I heard some things about that guy working for you." "Matthew," I said. My stomach tightened. "What things?" "People are saying he's got a rough history," George said. "Debt, bankruptcy, maybe legal trouble. Is that true?" I stared at him. "Where did you hear that?" He shrugged. "You know how towns are. I figured you should know." I drove home in silence, my thoughts racing. Someone was poisoning the town against Matthew. And I already knew who it was. Back at the farm, I found Matthew in the barn, repairing a fence post. I walked over and asked him directly, "Matthew, did you ever have financial trouble? Bankruptcy?" He looked startled, then ashamed. "Yes. About 10 years ago, I lost my job. Couldn't keep up with the bills. I filed for bankruptcy, but I paid everything back. Worked 3 jobs. It took years. Why? Why didn't you tell me? I didn't want you to think less of me." I nodded. "Someone's been spreading rumors, saying you're a con artist, that you're here to take advantage of me." His eyes widened. "That's not true." "I know," I said, "but someone wants people to believe it is." We both knew who. A few days later, things escalated. Matthew came to me early one morning. "The plow won't start. I tried everything." I went to the equipment shed. The plow was old but dependable. I opened the engine panel and froze. The wires were cut, clean, precise. My chest tightened. "Matthew," I said sharply, "did you do this?" He looked horrified. "No, I swear I didn't." "Then how did this happen?" "I don't know," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't know." I should have believed him, but I was angry, and I took it out on him. "You need to be more careful," I said coldly. "Mistakes like this cost money." He stared at me, wounded. "I didn't break it." "Then who did?" He turned away without answering. That night I couldn't sleep. The cuts were too clean, too deliberate. Then I remembered the cameras. I went to my office and pulled up the footage. Richard. He walked into the shed late at night, opened the panel, cut the wires. I watched it 3 times. My son was framing Matthew. The next morning, I drove to Richard's law office. My hands shook as I entered. He looked up, surprised. "Mom, I saw you on the cameras." "What cameras?" "The equipment shed. You cut the wires." He leaned back and smiled. "You don't have proof." "I have video." "Is it clear? Can you prove it's me? Or that the footage wasn't altered?" He shrugged. "Even if you could, who would believe you? I'm your son, and I'm a lawyer. You're defending a stranger with a record. What you're doing is wrong." "What's wrong," Richard said, "is you bringing a stranger into my inheritance." I realized then that I had already lost him. He smiled coldly. "You don't have proof, and even if you did, it wouldn't matter." He was right. And I didn't yet know how far he would go. I should have seen it coming. Matthew had been doing so well, learning so fast. Richard couldn't stand it. A week after our confrontation, he made his next move. It was early morning. The sun had just started to rise over the fields. Matthew and I were standing outside the grain silo, looking up at the roof. "I noticed a leak yesterday," Matthew said, pointing to a dark stain on the ceiling inside. "Water's getting in. If we don't fix it soon, the grain will get wet and spoil." I nodded. "All right, you go up and check the roof. I'll get the tools ready." Matthew looked up at the old wooden ladder leaning against the side of the silo. It was tall, maybe 20 feet. It had been there for years. "Be careful," I said. "That ladder's old." "I will," Matthew said. He started climbing. I watched him for a moment, then turned and walked back toward the house to make breakfast. I figured he'd be up there for a while, checking the shingles, figuring out what needed to be fixed. I was in the kitchen pouring coffee when I heard it, a loud crash, the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. My blood went cold. I dropped the coffee pot and ran outside. Matthew was lying on the ground near the base of the silo. The ladder was on the ground beside him. One of the rungs snapped in half. He wasn't moving. "Matthew!" I shouted, running over to him. He groaned. His eyes were open, but he wasn't looking at me. He was staring up at the sky, his face twisted in pain. "Don't move," I said, kneeling beside him. "Just stay still. I'm calling for help." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. "911, what's your emergency?" "My son fell from a ladder," I said, my voice breaking. "He's hurt. He's not moving right. We're at Patterson Farm, Route 12. "Paramedics are on the way," the operator said. "Stay with him." "Don't move him." I set the phone down and looked at Matthew. His breathing was shallow. His face was pale. He tried to sit up, but I put my hand on his shoulder. "Stay down," I said. "Help is coming." "It hurts," he whispered. "My chest. I can't breathe right." "I know," I said. "Just hold on. They're almost here." It felt like hours before the ambulance arrived, but it was probably only 10 minutes. The paramedics loaded Matthew onto a stretcher and drove him to the hospital. I followed behind in my truck, my heart pounding the entire way. At the hospital, Dr. Stevens came out to talk to me after they finished examining Matthew. "He's going to be okay," Dr. Stevens said. "But he has 3 broken ribs and a mild concussion. He's lucky he didn't have any internal injuries. We're going to keep him here for at least 2 weeks to monitor him." I nodded, relief flooding through me. "Can I see him?" "In a little while," Dr. Stevens said. "He's resting now. We gave him something for the pain,